Sleep was impossible that night. My mind replayed the sight of my own face grinning at me, accompanied by that silent Aghori. I barely noticed the sting of tears as I stared at the walls of my tiny guest house room, feeling both furious at my helplessness and paralyzed by dread. What if the stories of necromancy, of twisted rituals that reanimate the dead, were more than just rumor? That question circled in my brain, refusing to rest. Exhaustion must have overtaken me in the early hours, for I awoke to a hazy dawn light creeping through the window. I spent the next days torn between obsession and fear. I walked the ghats repeatedly, asking boatmen, flower sellers, incense peddlers, and even the wandering cows if they had seen a man who looked like me. Some sneered, some cursed me, others whispered that I should leave well enough alone. Rohit begged me to let it be, to come home, but I couldn't. The draw was too strong, like an itch in my soul that only the truth could scratch. Each day, I felt the tension grow, as though the city itself knew I was tampering with forbidden secrets. The nights brought no solace. I found myself waking suddenly, certain I heard chanting outside my window, only to discover emptiness. Then, just when I began to think I might be losing my grip on reality, a clue presented itself. A middle-aged priest from a small shrine near the edge of Varanasi approached me one afternoon as I was wandering aimlessly along the less crowded ghats. He said he had overheard me asking about the double and the Aghori, and he believed he knew where they might hide. He spoke in hushed tones, glancing around nervously as if afraid of eavesdroppers. He told me that there were stories of a small islet formed by the shifting sandbanks in the Ganges, not far downstream. It was rumored to be a place where the Aghori conducted their darkest rituals, far from prying eyes, accessible only by boat under the cover of night. The priest cautioned me that going there alone would be pure folly, but of course he did not volunteer to guide me, nor did he claim to have ever set foot on that haunted sandbank. Still, his whispered warning fueled my determination. 2 nights later, I found a boatman willing to take me downstream. He was old, grizzled, and smelled faintly of rum. He demanded an exorbitant fee, and I gave it to him without bargaining. Past midnight, the city lights dwindled behind us as we drifted along the gentle current. The sky was an expanse of black. The moon hid behind thick clouds. I could hear the rhythmic dip of the oar, the water slapping against the hull, and above it all, my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Eventually, we spotted a dark shape ahead, a small outcrop of land in the middle of the river, little more than a bleak sliver of sand and rock. The boatman refused to dock. He said he would wait some distance away, and if I did not return in 2 hours, he would leave. I agreed, stepping into the shallow water and making my way onto the sandbank. The place reeked of stillness, a suffocating emptiness accentuated by the hush of the river. In the dim, I made out a few twisted trees or shrubs near the center, their branches contorted like arthritic fingers. The sand felt damp and cold beneath my feet. I walked deeper into that tiny spit of land, guided only by a cheap flashlight. My sense of foreboding skyrocketed with each step. The beam of light revealed footprints in the sand, multiple sets, some barefoot, others wearing sandals. I followed them until they merged into a patch of muddied ground. My mouth felt dry, my pulse thrummed. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered. I froze. When the light steadied, I saw a figure emerging from behind the shrubs, hunched low, as though scuttling on all fours. My blood ran cold. As I strained my eyes, I realized it was a woman, her hair disheveled, her body covered in what looked like ceremonial ash. She was humming a low tune, her voice raspy. Then, as the flashlight caught her gaze, she hissed and fled, melting into the shadows. My immediate thought was that she might be an Aghori, or perhaps a victim. I didn't know which possibility frightened me more. As Rohit spoke, I felt a burning at the center of my forehead, just as I had that night, when an Aghori had pressed his finger there, leaving a smudge of ash. Call it imagination, call it a psychosomatic reaction, but it felt so visceral that I reached up and touched my brow, as though I expected to find fresh ashes on my skin. There was nothing but clammy sweat. "Are you sure it's not just a rumor?" I asked, hoping for a rational explanation. "Some hoax or a tourist who looks vaguely like me?" Rohit shook his head. "My cousin swears he saw the man up close. He swears it was you, down to your height, your build, your face. But the way that person looked at him, he said he's never felt so cold." Rohit paused. "Amit, you need to be careful. Whatever is going on, it might not be safe." I let out a shaky sigh and forced a smile. When has my job ever been safe? The next day, I went about my standard journalistic routine, trying to track down leads. Most refused to talk when I mentioned Aghori. Those who did said little beyond ominous warnings. One elderly boatman, missing several front teeth, spat on the ground at the mention of the word Aghori. Then he told me, in a voice trembling with either fear or anger, that these sadhus meddle with the boundary between life and death in ways no mortal should. He cursed them for taking away his grandson's corpse decades ago, before the boy could be cremated. The child's body, the boatman insisted, had been desecrated by the Aghori for dark rites. I felt my stomach twist in revulsion, but also in dread at how these stories kept cropping up again and again, dark whispers scattered like ashes on the breeze. That night, I found myself standing on one of the lesser-known ghats, a place overshadowed by decaying temples and half-collapsed buildings. The darkness came in swiftly, and with it, a chilling breeze that carried the sense of stagnant water, old stone, and burning husks. My footsteps felt heavy on the worn steps leading down to the water. The Ganges lapped softly at the shore, an eternal presence imbued with centuries of both reverence and sorrow. I had no definitive plan, only an unshakable compulsion to be there. Part of me hoped to confront the phantom that bore my face. Part of me dreaded that it was real. A few late-night rituals were underway in the distance. Silhouettes chanted mantras, flames danced. I walked until their voices faded, drawn by an almost tangible quiet that beckoned me deeper into the deserted area of the cremation ground. Then, near a cluster of burned logs and still glowing embers, I saw someone. At first I thought it was just another mourner, maybe a priest finishing a ceremony. But as I stepped closer, my entire body went rigid. The figure turned, the faint light of distant flames illuminating his features. I saw myself, or something that looked just like me. He, or it, was dressed in a simple shirt and tattered trousers, clothes that might have been identical to some I'd owned in the past. His skin was ashen, his eyes sunken, yet he wore the same angular jaw, the same high forehead, and even had a small mole on the left side of his neck that matched mine. The hair on my arms stood on end. For a moment I questioned my own sanity. Was this a mirror in the darkness, a hallucination conjured by my overtaxed mind? I whispered, "Who are you?" My voice quavered like a child's. The double smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that stretched too wide, revealing gums that seemed unnaturally pale. Then he raised his hand in a gesture of beckoning. In the flicker of a distant flame, I caught a glimpse of something crawling over his wrist, a string of Rudraksha beads or perhaps human finger bones. It was hard to be certain. Heart pounding, I took an involuntary step forward, as though mesmerized by the horrible familiarity. Suddenly, another presence loomed behind him, tall, gaunt, smeared in white ash, with tangled hair cascading over his shoulders. An Aghori Sadhu. My breath caught. The man's eyes shone with an eerie luminescence, and he placed a hand on my double shoulder as if claiming him, as if presenting him to me. There was something ritualistic in the gesture, a silent statement. This is ours. This is what we have created. I felt my throat tighten, as though an invisible hand had clutched it. The Aghori parted his lips, but made no sound. Yet the hush that enveloped us felt more deafening than any cry. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. The double and the Aghori simply stood there, observing me, their stillness more intimidating than any sudden movement. Finally, my nerve broke, and I stumbled backward. By the time I regained my footing and glanced up, they were gone, swallowed by the smoky darkness beyond the embers. I could not say how long I stood there, heart slamming against my chest, before I managed to retrace my steps back to more populated areas of the Ghats. It all began over a year ago when I traveled to Varanasi, a journey that should have been a routine assignment for me, a journalist looking to uncover unique spiritual practices along the Ganges. But from the moment my foot touched the ancient Ghats, an inexplicable tension clawed at me. Maybe it was the lingering trauma of my previous experiences with a group of Aghori Sadhus, men who dwell in cremation grounds and practice rituals most would label as macabre. I had reported on them once, narrowly escaping what felt like a brush with madness and death. Or maybe it was simply the ominous hush that hovered over the city's outskirts at night, as though the thin veil between the living and the dead had worn away. It did not help that I had been told, only weeks before, of sightings of someone who looked exactly like me in the vicinity of those same cremation grounds. I had discounted the rumors at first, attributing them to mistaken identity. Still, the mere idea of a double wandering the banks of the Ganges was enough to unnerve me. My friend Rohit, who had first brought me the story, insisted it was no mistake. He'd even shouted my name at the stranger, who turned and stared with cold, unnerving eyes before vanishing into the darkness. I thought I had put my previous run-ins with the Aghori behind me, that I had left those nightmares somewhere in the damp ashes of the burial Ghats. But life has a cruel sense of timing. Shortly after these rumors about my doppelganger reached me, my nights became plagued with nightmares of a figure chanting in a raspy voice, calling me to return. It was more than mere dreams, though. I'd awake drenched in sweat, the stench of burning flesh and incense still lingering in my nostrils. No matter how many times I opened and closed my eyes, that smell persisted, binding me to an unseen realm. Despite my instincts, or maybe because of them, I returned to Varanasi. I felt I had no choice. Something was pulling me back, with a force I could hardly resist, as if the city itself had extended spectral arms to reclaim me. I arrived at dusk, the sky bruised a dusky purple, the Ganges reflecting the lights of funeral pyres flickering against the oncoming night. There was a hush in the air, punctuated only by the faint sound of conches from distant temples. The Ghats were crowded, yet oddly silent. Families performed final rites for loved ones, chanting mantras in subdued voices, the swirling smoke rising in ghostly ribbons. That unique blend of sorrow and transcendence that I had always found so compelling now pressed in on me, heavier than any gloom I had experienced before. Rohit met me at my guest house, a modest two-story building with peeling paint near a narrow alley. He wore a worried expression I had seldom seen on his normally cheerful face. We exchanged formalities as we entered my room, a cramped space with a single bed, a desk, and a small window overlooking a labyrinth of alleys. I dropped my suitcase onto the bed, sat down, and asked for details. "Tell me everything," I said, barely able to mask the apprehension in my voice. Rohit explained how, over the past month, rumors had spread about a man who bore my exact visage. People reported seeing him at odd hours around the cremation grounds, speaking to no one, simply standing near the flames, staring. One or two had approached him, thinking it was me, only to be met with silence or the faintest grin that made their skin crawl. More chillingly, some claimed he was accompanied by figures in tattered robes, their bodies smeared with ash, their eyes ringed with black. It was these details that made me recall my own close encounter with the Aghori. In that earlier brush, I had found myself caught in one of their rituals late at night, an experience that ended in me blacking out on the sand, only to awake at sunrise with trodden embers and footprints surrounding me, the memory of delirious chanting echoing in my mind.